Most airline emergencies do not begin with fire or warning alarms. Many begin with silence that no one expects. In this documentary, we revisit 8 real flights that lost power at the worst possible moment. Some fell quiet just seconds before touchdown. Others lost thrust in heavy storms or far from land. A few continued flying with engines still running, but without the control needed to keep the wings level. Each story shows how quickly a routine flight can turn into a struggle to stay in the air, and how every second becomes a decision that shapes the final outcome. If you want to support documentaries like this, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us keep researching these events and telling the stories behind them. British Airways Flight 38 departed Beijing for London, after a long night of winter flying across Russia and the Arctic Circle. The aircraft, a Boeing 777, carried 136 people on board. For more than 10 hours, everything about the flight was routine. The passengers slept, the crew monitored fuel, weather, and systems, and the jet crossed thousands of miles of very cold air at cruise altitude. Cruising at high levels for long periods caused the fuel inside the tanks to cool far more than on shorter flights. The temperature dropped low enough for tiny ice crystals to form in the fuel. This is normal and fully expected. Jet fuel always contains small amounts of water, and at very low temperatures it becomes suspended as microscopic ice. These crystals usually melt harmlessly during descent as the aircraft moves into warmer air. On this flight, however, the combination of temperature, holding patterns, and fuel flow behavior created a rare and dangerous set of conditions inside both Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines. As Flight 38 approached London, air traffic control placed the jet into a standard hold near Heathrow. The descent was delayed and shallow, which meant the fuel warmed more slowly than usual. Ice crystals inside the fuel system began to migrate toward the fuel oil heat exchangers, small metal units with fine channels that warm cold fuel using hot engine oil. The design of these exchangers would become the central point of the investigation. After the hold, the aircraft was cleared for an ILS approach to runway 27 left. Visibility was good. The crew prepared for landing. They discussed wind, runway conditions, and landing configuration. Nothing in the cockpit suggested a problem. Engine instruments were stable, auto throttle responses were normal. Checklists were complete. To passengers, the aircraft felt like it was gliding smoothly toward home after a long night over the continent. At about 720 feet above ground level, the auto throttle commanded increased thrust to keep the aircraft on the glide path. The 777 was slightly low on speed, and the system responded as it had hundreds of thousands of times on other flights. The auto throttle advanced the thrust levers, and the crew expected both engines to spool up into approach power. They did not. Both engines remained at idle. The thrust did not increase at all. In a jet the size of the 777, the difference is immediately noticeable. The aircraft began to sink below the glide slope. Airspeed decreased. The captain pushed the thrust levers fully forward, but the engines did not respond. There was no surge, no spool up, no rise in noise. Both engines were still turning, but could not produce significant power. In the next few seconds, the cockpit went from routine approach to emergency. The first officer called out rapidly decreasing airspeed. The glide path deviation alert activated. The captain realized they could not reach the runway with the remaining energy. He lowered the nose slightly to preserve airspeed, trading precious altitude for control. Behind them, passengers felt the quiet sink and saw rooftops passing below the windows. Inside both engines, ice crystals that had formed during the long cruise had collected at the downstream face of the fuel oil heat exchangers. When the auto throttle demanded a sharp increase in fuel flow, the warm descent dislodged accumulated crystals, which then moved deeper into the exchanger's narrow passages. This caused a restriction in fuel flow to both engines at the exact moment power was needed. It was a failure mode never seen on a 777 before. At about 200 feet, the aircraft was far below the ideal approach path. The captain selected flap 25 to reduce drag. The first officer made a short radio call reporting a dual-engine power loss. With almost no thrust and no time to troubleshoot, the crew aimed for the strip of grass just short of the runway. Heathrow's perimeter fence was directly ahead, and beyond that, houses and busy roads. The captain aligned the sinking aircraft with the grass and prepared for a forced landing. The 777 touched down hard. The right main landing gear collapsed upward into the fuselage. The left gear failed a moment later. The nose gear detached on impact. The aircraft slid across the grass, tearing deep grooves into the soil. Panels separated, engines scraped the ground, and the left flap track tore free, but the fuselage stayed intact. When the aircraft came to a stop, a cloud of dust and debris settled around it, but no fire started. Inside the cabin, passengers were shaken but alive. Flight attendants initiated evacuation procedures. Slides deployed successfully. Emergency services arrived quickly. All 136 people survived. Only one passenger and one crew member suffered serious injuries. Investigators from the United Kingdom's Air Accidents Investigation Branch spent months analyzing the fuel system. They identified the root cause, a sudden blockage of the fuel oil heat exchangers by ice crystals that had accumulated during the extended cold flight and were released in the final phase of descent. When the engines demanded high flow, the crystals restricted the passages and prevented the engines from increasing power. Rolls-Royce redesigned the heat exchanger with wider flow paths and better tolerance for ice crystals. Boeing updated procedures, monitoring requirements, and documentation to ensure crews and operators understood the risks associated with extremely cold fuel after long cruise flights. Regulators required modifications to the entire Trent 800 fleet. British Airways Flight 38 is now studied as a rare example of a modern wide-body jet losing thrust on short final while still under full pilot control. It showed that icing hazards do not always form on the wings. They can hide inside fuel lines, unnoticed until the moment power is needed most. And it showed what skilled flight crew actions can accomplish even when the engines stay silent. Southern Airways Flight 242 departed Huntsville, Alabama on April 4, 1977. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, was flying a short multi-stop route through the southeastern United States. On board were 85 passengers and crew. Weather in the region looked unstable but manageable. Thunderstorms were common that time of year, and the crew expected only moderate turbulence and rain during the climb. As the aircraft approached the Atlanta area, controllers warned of severe weather building along the route. Two large storm cells were merging into a powerful supercell. Radar technology at the time was limited. Cockpit displays showed general precipitation but could not distinguish between heavy rain and extreme levels of water and hail. Storm structure, downdrafts, and hail cores were invisible to the crew. The aircraft entered the storm while climbing through 14,000 feet. Rain intensity rose quickly. The crew requested a deviation to avoid the worst of the weather. But by the time vectors were issued, the aircraft was already inside the main precipitation core. What looked like heavy rain on their radar was, in reality, an area of violent updrafts, hail, and extreme water concentration. Within moments, both Pratt & Whitney JT-8D engines began ingesting massive amounts of water. Jet engines can handle significant rainfall, but this storm exceeded the certified limits. Water disrupted the airflow through the compressors and caused severe compressor stalls. Flames shot out of the engines. Loud bangs echoed through the cabin. Both engines lost thrust almost simultaneously. The crew attempted multiple relight procedures, but the engines could not restart. The storm had effectively drowned them. The DC-9 now became a glider descending through turbulent air with no thrust, limited electrical power, and low altitude. The crew declared an emergency and began searching for a place to land. Visibility was poor, clouds were low, and the terrain below was a mix of forest and rural communities. The captain and first officer discussed using a nearby airport, but they did not have the altitude or distance to reach it. Breaking out of the clouds, the crew saw a straight stretch of highway near the small town of New Hope, Georgia. It was narrow, lined with trees, and not designed for aircraft, but it was the only option. The captain aligned the powerless DC-9 with the highway and lowered the landing gear manually. Speed was decreasing. Control margins were thin. Cars on the road braked and swerved as the aircraft descended toward them. The DC-9 touched down on the highway at high speed. The right wing struck a gas station and several vehicles. The aircraft broke apart as it slid across the pavement and into nearby structures. A post-crash fire erupted, fueled by ruptured fuel tanks and highway debris. Despite the severity of the impact, 22 people survived, including both pilots, who continued trying to assist passengers after the crash. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the aircraft had flown directly into an area of extreme precipitation, far beyond what the crew believed they were entering. The outdated radar system did not show the true severity of the storm, or identify the hail and water concentration that overwhelmed both engines. The engines themselves functioned as designed, but the volume of water far exceeded certification conditions. The crew also received incomplete weather information from air traffic control due to the rapidly changing storm. Southern Airways Flight 242 became a landmark case in aviation weather training. The accident led to major improvements in weather radar technology, storm detection, and crew procedures. Modern radars now show storm gradients, turbulence, and hail signatures that were invisible in 1977. Controllers receive more detailed real-time storm data, and aircraft engines are tested under more demanding conditions. The forced landing on the highway is still studied today for the crew's composure during a total power loss in severe weather. Their decisions in the final seconds saved many lives and turned a catastrophic dual-engine failure into a survivable event. Air Transat Flight 236 departed Toronto on August 24, 2001, bound for Lisbon with 306 people on board. The aircraft was an Airbus A310-300. The ocean crossing was expected to be routine. Weather over the North Atlantic was calm, and the flight plan called for a standard Great Circle route toward the Azores. Early in the flight, fuel flow readings began to show slight irregularities. The right engine appeared to be using more fuel than expected. The crew reviewed the gauges and checked the fuel balance. They considered the possibility of a sensor error. Nothing indicated a leak. Pressurization was normal, engine parameters were stable. The right fuel tank quantity was decreasing faster than predicted, but not at a rate that clearly pointed to a structural or mechanical failure. What the crew could not see was a developing problem inside the number 2 engine's nacelle. A hydraulic line and a fuel line had been installed incorrectly during maintenance, leaving the fuel line vulnerable to vibration. The line eventually cracked. Under pressure, fuel escaped into the engine pylon and was carried out of the aircraft by the slipstream. The leak was not visible from the cockpit, and early indications resembled a routine imbalance rather than an emergency. As the flight crossed the midpoint of the Atlantic, fuel calculations continued to drift from expected values. The first officer raised concerns several times. The captain agreed to monitor the trend. They contacted company maintenance control via radio and reviewed troubleshooting steps. The situation remained ambiguous. Without clear evidence of a leak and with fuel still available in both tanks, the crew continued on their route. At about 4 hours into the flight, the imbalance became more pronounced. The captain ordered cross-feed operations to balance the tanks. This action allowed fuel from the left side to flow toward the right engine, unintentionally feeding the leak. The leak rate increased. Over time, thousands of kilograms of fuel were lost over the Atlantic. At 3 hours and 51 minutes after departure, the right engine lost usable fuel and flamed out. The crew initiated the engine out checklist and turned toward the Azores. They declared a fuel emergency. The Airbus, now flying on a single engine, descended slightly as airspeed and performance stabilized. The crew prepared for a one-engine approach into Lajes Air Base on Terceira Island, the closest available runway. About 13 minutes later, while still more than 60 nautical miles from Lajes, the left engine also lost fuel pressure and shut down. The aircraft had become a glider over the Atlantic with 306 people on board. The captain lowered the nose to maintain airspeed and prevent a stall. Electrical system switched to emergency power supplied by the ram air turbine. The cabin lights dimmed. The hydraulic system operated in a reduced configuration. The Airbus descended in a controlled glide. At first glance, the cockpit was calm. The engines were silent, but the airframe responded smoothly. The captain calculated glide distance, wind conditions, and descent rate. With careful management of speed and altitude, the aircraft could just reach Lajes if conditions remained stable. The approach into Lajes Air Base was one of the longest power-off descents ever performed by a commercial airliner. The Airbus glided for more than 75 minutes from the first engine failure to touchdown. As the aircraft neared the coastline, the crew realized they were high and fast. With no thrust available, They deployed speed brakes to increase drag and adjusted pitch to reach a safe landing point. The captain aligned with runway 33. Without thrust or normal hydraulics, the landing gear deployed using gravity. The aircraft touched down hard at high speed. The tires burst. The brakes overheated and caught fire. The Airbus veered to the side of the runway and came to a stop after a long slide. Despite the violent landing, there was no loss of life. All 306 occupants survived. 32 suffered minor injuries during the evacuation. Investigators found that the fuel line had been damaged during engine replacement 12 days earlier. The routing error caused repeated vibration that eventually cracked the line. The leak was small at first, making it difficult for the crew to confirm. Cross-feeding during flight unintentionally worsened the loss. Procedures for fuel leak detection were revised, and Airbus updated checklists to prevent cross-feed unless a leak is positively ruled out. Maintenance standards were tightened industry-wide, and engine change procedures were rewritten to avoid routing conflicts. Air Transat Flight 236 is now studied as one of the most remarkable examples of crew resource management and aircraft gliding performance. The crew guided a wide-body airliner across the ocean without engines and made a survivable landing against overwhelming odds. Their actions prevented a major disaster and reshaped procedures for leak identification and long-range flight safety. Polish Airlines Flight 16 departed Newark for Warsaw on November 1, 2011. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, carrying 231 people. The long transatlantic flight progressed normally. Weather over Poland was calm, and the crew expected a standard approach into Chopin Airport. Shortly before descent, the first indication of a problem appeared. The hydraulic system that powered one of the landing gear extension circuits showed abnormal pressure. The crew began troubleshooting while maintaining their planned arrival. Initial checks did not reveal a clear failure. All instruments except the landing gear indicators appeared normal. Electrical power was stable. Flight controls responded correctly. With no immediate evidence of a critical issue, the descent continued. As the aircraft neared Warsaw, the crew selected the landing gear lever to the down position. They waited for the familiar rumble beneath the floor as the wheels extended. Instead, the cockpit received no green lights. The gear doors remained closed. The Boeing stayed in a clean configuration. The pilots tried again. The result was the same. The main landing gear and the nose gear were not moving at all. The crew initiated the alternate gear extension system. On the 767, this system uses stored hydraulic pressure and mechanical uplock release to drop the gear using gravity. The backup system also failed. The hydraulic failure that had appeared minor earlier was now blocking both primary and alternate gear extension pathways. With both systems disabled, the landing gear was locked inside the fuselage. The aircraft entered a holding pattern over Warsaw. The flight crew reviewed every option in the manual. They discussed electrical resets, pressure checks, and circuit breaker procedures. Nothing restored hydraulic power to the gear extension system. The passengers, now aware of the delay, received calm but direct updates from the captain fire crews gathered on the runway below as the situation became clear. The Boeing 767 remained fully controllable. Both engines were operating normally. Flight controls, powered by separate hydraulic systems, functioned without difficulty. Yet the aircraft could not land safely on its wheels. The only remaining option was a fully belly-down landing with no landing gear at all. The captain briefed the cabin crew and coordinated with Warsaw controllers for an emergency landing on runway 33. The airport suspended all other operations and covered the runway with fire-retardant foam to reduce friction and lower the risk of sparks. Emergency vehicles lined both sides. The crew completed the approach checklist and kept the aircraft slightly high and stable on the glide path. At decision altitude, the captain disconnected the autopilot and prepared for manual flight. With the landing gear retracted, the aircraft's drag profile was lower than usual. Speed management became critical. Too fast would increase the risk of structural damage. Too slow would risk a stall. The captain used precise pitch adjustments to control both descent and airspeed. As the Boeing crossed the runway threshold, the captain raised the nose gently and allowed the fuselage to settle onto the foam-covered pavement. The tail skid touched first, followed by the smooth underside of the main fuselage. Sparks and smoke trailed behind the aircraft as metal scraped across the runway. The engines shut down automatically on impact with the ground. The aircraft remained level and slid in a straight line for several hundred meters before coming to a complete stop. The cabin remained intact. There was no fire. Evacuation slides deployed normally. Passengers and crew exited the aircraft quickly. All 231 people survived without serious injury. For many, the landing felt surprisingly calm, despite the severity of the event. Investigators later found that a hydraulic hose in the central gear extension system had failed during cruise. When the crew attempted to lower the gear, hydraulic pressure was unavailable. The backup system could not release the mechanical uplocks due to an unrelated electrical circuit issue that prevented solenoid activation. This combination of failures, while extremely rare, made both gear extension methods unusable. The Polish State Commission recommended design improvements, inspection changes, and training updates for alternate gear extension procedures. Boeing revised documentation related to gear uplock circuitry. AirAsia redesignated maintenance checks for critical hydraulic lines. Polish Airlines Flight 16 is now considered one of the most successful gear-up landings in commercial aviation. The crew maintained full control after a complete landing gear failure and executed a precise belly landing that protected every life on board. The event is frequently studied as an example of disciplined cockpit communication, calm decision-making, and exact energy management during a landing without mechanical support. TACA Flight 110 departed Belize City for New Orleans on May 15, 1988. The aircraft was a Boeing 737. On board were 45 passengers and crew. The weather forecast for Louisiana called for thunderstorms around the approach corridor, but conditions appeared manageable. The crew expected moderate rain during descent and nothing more. As the aircraft neared New Orleans, air traffic control guided it toward a path that passed between several storm cells. The weather radar showed areas of heavy rain ahead, but the limitations of radar at the time made it difficult to distinguish routine thunderstorm bands from the far more dangerous cores hidden inside them. The crew steered as best they could through what looked like the safest gap. The Boeing entered an area of intense rainfall and hail while descending toward 3,000 feet. The cockpit noise increased sharply as hail struck the fuselage. Visibility outside the windshield dropped to almost nothing. Inside, both CFM engines, rain and hail began to enter in volumes far beyond certification limits. Modern jet engines can withstand significant precipitation. But this storm pushed the airflow far outside normal conditions. Within seconds, both engines began to surge. The sound shifted from steady power to loud metallic bangs. Flames appeared briefly at the engine inlets as compressor stalls grew more severe. The left engine then lost thrust completely. Moments later, the right engine also collapsed. The Boeing 737 had lost all usable power. The combined failures happened so quickly that the crew had little time to analyze the situation. The aircraft was now gliding in heavy rain with no thrust and no guarantee of maintaining altitude. Electrical systems shifted to standby power. The captain leveled the wings, lowered the nose slightly, and stabilized the descent. He ordered the first officer to begin restart procedures. Multiple attempts were made to bring at least one engine back online, but the airflow conditions inside the cores were too disrupted to allow a successful relight. Rain and hail had extinguished the combustion process in both engines. The crew declared an emergency. The captain asked for vectors to the nearest open area, but quickly realized that without thrust, they could not reach the airport. The storm clouds thinned slightly as the aircraft descended through 2,000 feet. The crew could now see the terrain below. Swamps, roads, and industrial areas dominated the landscape. A safe landing spot was difficult to identify. At about 1,500 feet, the captain noticed a stretch of grass and soft soil near the NASA Michoud Assembly Facility in eastern New Orleans. It was flat, open, and long enough for a forced landing. With no thrust, limited hydraulic support, and heavy rain still falling, the captain aligned the Boeing with the field. As the aircraft descended below 1,000 feet, the captain lowered the landing gear using the alternate extension system. The gear locked into place. The first officer monitored airspeed and altitude while relaying updates to controllers. The cabin remained calm. Passengers felt the quiet glide as the engines remained silent. The Boeing touched down on the grass with near-perfect control. Water sprayed across the field as the wheels dug into the soft soil. The aircraft rolled forward, slowed rapidly, and came to a stop without skidding or breaking apart. There was no structural failure. No fire started. All 45 people on board survived without serious injury. The landing became one of the most celebrated examples of a forced landing in a modern airliner. The captain later credited training, crew coordination, and a clear understanding of the aircraft's glide capabilities. Passengers praised the calm professionalism of both pilots. NTSB investigators determined that the engines had ingested unmanageable volumes of water and hail during the descent. The storm contained an area of concentrated precipitation stronger than radar suggested. The engine stalled and flamed out due to airflow disruption in the compressor stages. Both engines were later found to be fully functional once dried and inspected, confirming that the failures were weather-induced rather than mechanical. The investigation led to improvements in weather radar design and training for storm penetration avoidance. It also prompted updated engine certification standards for water and hail ingestion. TACA Flight 110 is still studied today as a near-textbook example of a complete dual-engine loss and a flawless power-off landing. The crew guided a fully loaded jet through extreme weather and identified one of the only survivable landing sites in the region. Their decisions kept every person on board alive and set a benchmark for emergency handling under total power loss. AirAsia Flight 8501 departed Surabaya for Singapore on December 28, 2014. The aircraft, an Airbus A320 with 162 people on board, climbed steadily toward cruise altitude weather. Along the route included large tropical storm clouds that were typical for the region, but the flight plan showed several clear lanes between cells. During the climb, the captain and first officer noticed intermittent warnings from the rudder travel limiter system. This unit controls how far the rudder can move at high speeds. On this aircraft, a series of earlier maintenance entries had documented recurring fault messages. The underlying cause was a cracked solder joint on a circuit board inside the flight augmentation computer. The fault would clear and return unpredictably. At 32,000 feet, the warning reappeared. The captain decided to reset the system, a procedure the airline had used previously when the fault occurred. The first reset did not clear the message. The crew attempted additional resets by pulling and re-engaging circuit breakers. Each reset had the side effect of causing multiple flight control laws to momentarily reconfigure. These actions were outside the normal checklist flow for the A320. After the final reset attempt, the autopilot disconnected. The aircraft returned to direct flight control law, with no automatic protections. Almost immediately, the flight director presented guidance that the first officer misinterpreted. The aircraft rolled and pitched upward. The nose began to climb rapidly. The pitch angle increased far beyond normal cruise attitude. The engines were still producing power, but the aircraft was no longer maintaining safe aerodynamic conditions. As the pitch increased, the indicated airspeed began to fall. The stall warning activated. The first officer continued pulling back on the side stick, believing the aircraft needed more pitch to regain control, when in reality, it needed the opposite. Without the normal protections of Airbus flight law, the aircraft was now fully vulnerable to high angle of attack behavior. Within seconds, the wings stopped generating enough lift. The Airbus entered a full aerodynamic stall. The aircraft rolled left, then right, then settled into a steep descent. The engines continued to operate, but thrust was no longer effective because the airflow over the wings was disrupted. In the cockpit, the stall warning repeated continuously. The captain attempted to intervene, but the difference in side-stick inputs from both pilots made recovery more difficult. With no visual horizon and rapidly changing attitude, the crew struggled to regain coordinated control. The aircraft descended through thunderstorm clouds toward the Java Sea. Radar track data showed repeated roll inputs and altitude changes as the pilots tried to break the stall, but neither reduced the angle of attack enough to restore lift. The A320 remained in a deep stall until it impacted the water at high vertical speed. All 162 occupants were lost. Investigators from the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee traced the accident to a combination of technical and human factors. The cracked solder joint produced repeated rudder limiter faults. The crew attempted resets that were not part of the approved Airbus procedure. These actions disengaged the autopilot and removed the normal protections that prevent excessive pitch. The following manual inputs placed the aircraft outside its safe aerodynamic envelope. Although the engines never lost power, the aircraft lost lift due to an extended high angle of attack. The accident led to several changes. Airlines updated procedures related to circuit breaker usage and system resets. Training programs sharpened focus on manual flight at high altitude, and stall recognition. Airbus issued guidance on handling repetitive rudder limiter faults and emphasized strict adherence to automated flight laws. AirAsia Flight 8501 is now studied as a clear example of aerodynamic power loss. The engines continued to run, yet the aircraft could not fly because the wings no longer produced lift. It remains a reminder that in modern commercial aviation, control of angle of attack is as critical as control of thrust. Hapag-Lloyd Flight 3378 departed Chania for Hanover on July 12, 2000. The aircraft was an Airbus A310-300 with 143 people on board. The weather was clear, and the crew expected an uncomplicated flight across Greece, the Balkans, and Central Europe. Minutes after takeoff, an abnormal indication appeared on the landing gear system. The right main landing gear did not retract. The crew attempted a second retraction cycle. The left gear doors closed, but the right gear remained down and locked. The captain and first officer reviewed the situation. The aircraft was stable and controllable, but flying with the gear extended created significant aerodynamic drag. This drag would increase fuel burn far beyond normal values. The crew contacted maintenance control and discussed options. The airline recommended continuing toward Hanover while monitoring fuel. At first, fuel calculations appeared acceptable. The crew believed they had enough fuel to reach their destination even with increased drag. What they did not realize was that the true fuel consumption with the gear down was far higher than the flight management system estimated. The A310's computers were designed to compensate for routine conditions, not extended cruise with the landing gear fully deployed. As the aircraft crossed Serbia, fuel readings began to diverge from predictions. Several recalculations were made, and each showed a more concerning trend. The aircraft was burning fuel at a rate up to 50% higher than planned. The crew requested shortcuts from air traffic control and reduced speed to conserve fuel. Despite these measures, the remaining fuel was decreasing faster than anticipated. Approaching Austria, the captain and first officer recognized they could not reach Hanover. They chose Vienna as the alternate airport. The aircraft began a gradual descent, but new calculations showed that even Vienna might be too far. The crew contacted the airport and declared a fuel emergency. Controllers cleared airspace and prepared for an immediate approach. As the aircraft neared Vienna, the situation worsened. Fuel remaining was now critically low. The crew extended the remaining flaps and prepared for landing. At this point, the A310 had been flying for more than 2 hours with the landing gear fully extended. The drag had consumed fuel reserves much faster than any onboard calculation had predicted. At approximately 10,000 feet, the right engine lost power due to fuel starvation. The aircraft remained controllable with one engine, and the crew continued toward the runway. Moments later, the left engine also flamed out. The Airbus was now gliding toward Vienna with no thrust and limited electrical and hydraulic capability. The ram air turbine deployed automatically, providing essential systems. Below 4,000 feet, the crew realized they were still short of the runway. The aircraft was descending over uneven terrain east of the airport. The captain selected a shallow glide path toward the flattest visible area. The remaining flaps were used to control speed without losing too much altitude. The objective was to reach the airport perimeter or at least a survivable flat surface. Passing below 2,000 feet, Vienna Airport came into partial view, but the aircraft did not have enough energy to reach the runway. The captain aimed for a grassy, slightly rising area near the boundary of the airport. The A310 touched down with the landing gear still extended, but with no thrust, the roll could not be controlled fully. The aircraft bounced, slid across the uneven ground, and came to a stop short of the runway. Despite the loss of both engines, the hard touchdown, and the rough terrain, the fuselage remained intact. All 143 occupants survived. Several passengers suffered minor injuries, but no fatal injuries occurred. The successful forced landing became one of the most remarkable power-off landings in a wide-body jet. Investigators from the German BFU found multiple contributing factors. The initial cause was the jammed right main landing gear, which created excessive drag and increased fuel burn. The flight management system did not accurately model fuel consumption under these abnormal conditions. Communications between the crew and the airline contributed to the decision to continue flight rather than divert sooner. In addition, several recalculations were made using incorrect assumptions, which delayed recognition of the fuel emergency. As a result of the accident, Airbus updated the flight management system logic to better account for abnormal drag. Airlines revised training to emphasize early diversion when fuel consumption deviates significantly from expected values. Procedures for landing gear failures were strengthened, and Hapag-Lloyd revised its dispatch guidance and in-flight decision protocols. Hapag-Lloyd Flight 378 remains a powerful example of how a sequence of small decisions can lead to a critical situation and how disciplined piloting can still protect every life on board. The crew guided a powerless wide-body aircraft across difficult terrain and delivered a survivable landing under the most challenging fuel starvation conditions. United Airlines Flight 232 departed Denver for Chicago on July 19, 1989. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 with 219 people on board. The takeoff and climb were uneventful. The flight leveled off at cruise altitude and continued east across Iowa. There were no signs of trouble until a sudden explosion shook the entire airframe. At 37,000 feet, the number 2 engine mounted in the tail suffered a catastrophic fan disc failure. The titanium disc disintegrated under extreme stress and broke into multiple fragments. These fragments were expelled outward with tremendous force. The DC-10 had 3 independent hydraulic systems designed to ensure that even a major failure would not disable the aircraft. However, the shrapnel from the disc struck all 3 hydraulic lines routed through the tail section. Within seconds, the pressure in all 3 systems dropped to 0. The crew attempted to move the control column and noticed no response. The aircraft no longer had functioning elevators, rudder, or ailerons. Every primary flight control surface was inoperative. With no hydraulic pressure, the DC-10 could not pitch up or down through normal means, could not bank, and could not turn in the conventional way. Although all 3 engines continued to produce thrust, the aircraft had effectively lost the ability to fly. The captain, first officer, and a training check airman who was riding in the jump seat worked together to understand the situation. They confirmed that no amount of control input changed the aircraft's attitude. The DC-10 began to drift into a gentle right bank, descending slowly. The crew tried every backup system described in the manual, but none applied to a scenario where all hydraulic lines were severed. With traditional controls gone, the only influence the crew had over the aircraft was differential engine thrust. Increasing power on the left engine produced a slight turn to the right. Increasing power on the right engine produced a slight turn to the left. Adjusting thrust on the tail-mounted engine affected pitch, but only very roughly. The aircraft responded slowly and unpredictably. The cockpit workload rose dramatically as the crew attempted to coordinate thrust changes to counteract the worsening bank angle and descent. The crew declared an emergency and requested vectors to the nearest airport. Sioux City, Iowa, was the only viable option within range. Controllers cleared all airspace and provided headings, although the crew could not precisely follow them. Instead, they shaped a wide right turn using asymmetric thrust and attempted to stabilize their approach path. As the aircraft neared Sioux City, the crew prepared for a landing unlike any described in training. They could not control airspeed or glide path with the precision required for a standard approach. The DC-10 oscillated in pitch. Airspeed fluctuated dangerously. The crew communicated clearly, with one member reading instruments, another adjusting thrust, and the captain monitoring attitude. At about 1,000 feet, the aircraft rolled sharply and then corrected. The crew fought to stabilize it using throttle movements measured in inches. The runway came into sight as the DC-10 descended at a high and unstable rate. The captain called for maximum control through thrust alone. The left wing dropped slightly just before touchdown. The aircraft contacted the runway in a right-wing low attitude. The right wing broke off. The fuselage split as it tumbled, slides deployed automatically, and debris scattered across the airfield. Despite the violent crash sequence, 185 people survived. Many walked away from the wreckage. The survival rate was far higher than investigators initially believed possible for a near-uncontrollable aircraft. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the fan disc failure resulted from a fatigue crack that had formed years earlier and gone undetected during inspections. When the disc failed, fragments severed all 3 hydraulic systems. The DC-10 was designed with hydraulic redundancy, but not with spatial separation, adequate to protect against a single point of failure from engine shrapnel. McDonnell Douglas and the FAA introduced new rules mandating physical separation of redundant systems in future aircraft. United Airlines Flight 232 is widely regarded as one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of cockpit teamwork and improvisation in aviation history. The engines continued to run, yet the aircraft was impossible to control through conventional means. The crew relied solely on differential thrust and cooperative decision-making to guide the crippled jet toward a survivable landing. Their actions saved many lives and altered the design philosophy of modern commercial aircraft. Every case in this documentary shows a different way an aircraft can lose the one resource pilots depend on most. Sometimes it is fuel. Sometimes it is weather. Sometimes it is a mechanical failure that removes control even while the engines still run. In each event, the pattern is the same. When power fades or when lift disappears, time becomes shorter, and choices become fewer. If you want to support documentaries like this, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps us continue researching real events and telling the stories behind them in a responsible and factual way.